In this video, I'm going to show you how to change your water pump. And here in the FJ, it looks quite complicated. It has these routes that go through the side, and a lot of vehicles, it's going to be a very simple little pump like this, which is easy to change out, but it's a bit more complicated, which makes it a good example for this video. If you can change this, you can change any water pump in a vehicle for the most part. And I'm doing this at home with no special tools, all common hand tools, so you should be able to do this at home. So why are we changing our pump? If we take a look down here, we could see some pinkish crust forming in there. We have a water pump leak here, which will continue to evolve into a serious leak, and we have to fix that. So changing your water pump, it is necessary to drain your fluid. That's because your coolant runs through that pump, and if you remove it without draining the coolant, you're gonna spill your coolant all over the place, and that's not good. So before we start, always make sure that you're working on a cold engine. All of the tools used in this video are down in the description below. The first step, drain that coolant. To do that, we go under the truck, and in my case, I have a skid plate. But to make this easier to see, I'm gonna go ahead and take off my plate. With that shield removed, here is our radiator on this side, and right behind it, on this edge, we have our petcock. So you'll have usually a port like this, either on this side or the other side. Now this petcock has a little tube. Here's a trick. Let's go back into the engine bay. If you have a tube somewhere in your engine that you could use for this, you could go ahead and borrow it. So we're gonna take our tube and connect it into there. And now we have this spout that we could put right into our bottle. And it's that simple. We're ready to start draining the coolant. So make sure that you label your containers, especially if it's something that someone could drink out of. So quite simply, get your pliers and turn this, and with a little bit, it should be easy to turn it by hand. You can see our coolant is flowing out, and we're just gonna let that drain into here. As your coolant drains, it's gonna build pressure in the system, so make sure you take off your cap so that pressure doesn't build and your coolant can continue to drain out. Our coolant is completely drained. We have no more coming out, so we could remove this. This will drain all of the coolant that's in the radiator, but because our engine is cold, the ports that access the engine are closed off. Our thermostat is closed. That being said, there's a lot of coolant in the engine that we're not going to be able to take out by just draining the radiator. So in that case, engines come with a port specifically to drain the engine coolant. If you go online and look for your engine coolant drain plugs, you'll find a diagram of where they are. Now, it's important to mention that a lot of vehicles, if not most vehicles, do not have an engine coolant drain plug. In our truck, we come to the left side, right here under the wheel well. That right there, we just take off that bolt, and through this tube, the coolant from the engine will drain. Wrench with a couple of extensions and break that 10mm bolt loose. Number 2, extend this, and there we go. And I'm gonna let the engine drain now. So we can close this back up now. With that, our engine plug is completely drained. With that done, we're ready to start removing parts to get better access to that water pump. So let's get started with removing the coolant lines and getting them out of the way. And there we go, that's our coolant line removed. And now we can remove this line, and if our hose is stubborn, just wiggle it back and forth. Don't use a lot of pressure on here. This is plastic and it can break or deform if you pry on this too much. So, and there we go. Just wiggle it back and forth a little bit. And our final connection here. And we can take this off. So we need to remove this. So to remove the clips, we simply pry on each side a little bit and try to get those clips out without breaking them if you want to reuse them. Next, in many modern vehicles, you'd remove your fan shroud, and the fan shroud comes along with your fan. But in this case, the fan is connected to the engine, so we need to remove this fan, and then we could remove the fan shroud and pull it out. Removing the fan is pretty straightforward. We have these 4 bolts here we need to take off, and the fan should come out. So we take our 12mm. If I try to take this bottom one off, just by turning, you can see it turns everything, which is not what we want. So we take our wrench here, which is larger, and we put it on this side, and we brace it against the peg, and now we're able to turn this without the engine turning. And there we go. This one's loose. And there we go. All 4 are loose. And we can continue to remove our fan shroud. And on this side we have 2 more right here. That's 1. And that's 2. And one final step is to remove this hose here. So just pull this right off, just like that. And this shroud is free to come out. And with the fan and fan shroud removed, we have a ton of room here to work and remove that water pump. Now, if you wanted to, you could also remove your radiator, which would give you a little bit more space, but in this case, I'm gonna go ahead and leave my radiator on the truck. And now we could remove our serpentine belt, and before you do that, make sure you draw a nice picture of how everything looks and where the bands go through so that you can put it back together afterwards. In my case, I have a service manual which tells me how it goes on, so I'm able to remove this now, and I have a nice picture so that I can put it back together later. To make this a tad bit easier, we're gonna be using this long breaker bar. Removing your serpentine belt is quite simple. You're going to have a pulley that is a tensioner pulley, which is this one right here, and you simply put a socket on there, pull it, and it'll release the serpentine belt so you can remove it. And since we removed our fan, this pulley comes off as well. And with the tension loose from our belt, we could remove our belt. The next step is to remove the thermostat housing and assembly. In this vehicle, this has to be removed because it connects directly into the pump. So we can start removing it with a couple of bolts on this side. When you're removing bolts, you want to make sure they're the same size. If they're not, you need to find a way to memorize where that longer or shorter bolt goes. But if they're all the same, then you can put them all together and just know that this is for the thermostat housing. And in this case, these two are the same, so we're good so far. And more coolant is leaking out, so make sure you have your pans underneath to catch the coolant. And once all your bolts are removed and this is loose, just remove all of your hoses and this should come right off. And there we go, our thermostat housing is out. And now we have pretty good access to our water pump here. The next step is to remove these 2 idler pulleys that are here. And these are in our way to take off some bolts, so we just need to take these off. So removing these is quite simple. We just take our breaker bar and we're able to remove our pulley. And once we break that loose, let's break the other one loose now that we're here. And we can take it out the rest of the way with our ratchet now. On the inside, we're gonna have something that looks like a washer, and this is mostly a dust cover for your bearing. And that's one. Let's take out the other. Make sure you keep track of which one goes where. And there's one more thing that's in our way, and that's our tensioner. However, removing that tensioner is a big job. So what I want to check first is if I could do this without removing the tensioner. So if I take my breaker bar and I tension this belt, I could see that it just about frees up this enough space to take this bolt out without removing the entire tensioner assembly. This is going to save us a lot of work. So when we get to that bolt, we'll use this breaker bar to get that tensioner out of the way, and we'll remove that bolt. As we're removing the bolts from down here, we're going to put the bolts in their hole up here so we can keep track of which goes where. So this is pretty straightforward. We just take off all the bolts. And when you take this off, again, more coolant is going to leak out of here, so make sure, again, you have your trays underneath. And all the bolts, except for the one behind the tensioner pulley, is removed. So now we're going to tension this as much as we can to get this out of the way. And there we go, we were able to remove it without taking off the tensioner pulley. And finally, we left one bolt up here so this wouldn't fall out. We remove this bolt and our water pump will come out. Here is our gasket, and the gasket is in pretty rough condition. There's definitely a need to change. This gasket material is all falling apart, and this was going to get worse over time, so it's a good thing we're changing it now. And before we put in our new pump, we want to clean the surface and make sure this is nice and clean. Otherwise, we risk having another leak with our new pump. We're also going to use a sponge with a abrasive pad to clean all this off. Finally, we're going to take a paper towel and some parts cleaner or carburetor cleaner, and we're going to clean that surface with this parts cleaner. And with our surface nice and clean, we're ready to install our brand new water pump. So make sure you get your gasket on there. And with the location of all the bolts noted, we've left one bolt on this side and one bolt on this side for alignment, and we're going to align this and put it on. Line everything up. And there we go, it's in position. So what we're gonna do is apply these with a bit of a medium strength thread locker, but these longer ones go into the timing chain chamber. That means we need to put a little bit of sealant on these threads, which is going to be gasket instead of thread locker. So for these shorter ones, we put thread locker. Just a little dab of thread locker and we could put it in. Next, these larger bolts need to get some silicone. So we're just gonna get a little bit of this gray gasket maker sealant and put a little bit up on the tips of this. I'm gonna get it all the way around and that should be good. And the final bolt goes here where the pulley is. Screw in by hand. And with that, all of our bolts are in and we can start torquing them down to spec. In a crisscross pattern, we're gonna start tightening these. The small ones are torqued down to 9 Newton meters and the large ones to 23 Newton meters. If you're using foot pounds, the large ones are 17 foot pounds and the small ones are around 6.6 foot pounds. In many vehicles, that's pretty much it. You just remove your old water pump and install your new one. However, mine connects to my thermostat housing, so I have to put a gasket here and it comes in the box with the original, and we place this one here. And then we have another gasket which goes up here on a tube. Over here on this side, we have this tube which goes into the thermostat housing, and we also have a replacement gasket for that. So to remove this old gasket, we're gonna use this pick. Okay, and the gasket ripped as I was trying to pull it out, and that is not normal. This gasket was definitely damaged. Getting the new gasket in is pretty simple. We just push it in over this tube and into its place. And there we go. And with that in its place, we could reinstall our thermostat housing. We need to make sure we reconnect all of the tubes. We can then push this into place. And again, these go torqued down to 9 Newton meters or 6.6 pounds foot. And now we have to reinstall all of our clips. And finally, we install our idler pulley. So put a bit of thread locker on there and thread it in, and then tighten them to 29 pounds foot. And over here on the other side, we thread in our second one and tighten it down to 29 pounds foot. With that, we can install our belt according to our picture and tension this. With the belt in its place, we could put in our fan and fan shroud. With that in place, we could screw in our fan shroud. Now this is on plastic, so make sure you just snug it up. Don't tighten it too much or you're gonna break that plastic. Reconnect our hose here. And now we can reinstall our fan. So hand tighten all of these nuts on here. These have to be pretty tight at 44 pounds foot. Now I can't get the torque meter in here, so I'm just gonna torque them down really tight with my wrenches, and it's pretty much the best I can do. So we're gonna do the reverse of what we did earlier. We're gonna brace it and tighten the heck out of this. Just like that. That's 2. That's 3. And 4. And we're getting very close to finishing this job. Now we just need to connect our coolant in and out. So here is the coolant in. And there is our second hose. With our hoses in place, we just need to put our hose clamps back. Now add this plastic cover here. The clips are somewhat deformed out, so they need a bit of persuasion to get into the holes. Line it up, and with the screwdriver, push one tab in at a time, and then I'm able to get it in there. And with all that done, we're finally ready for the last step, which is to fill our coolant. With our petcock valve closed and our engine valve also closed, we could start filling this up. As you're filling up, it's a good idea to go under the truck and check that there's nothing leaking anywhere. It doesn't look like it, so we can continue to fill in our radiator. All right, so our radiator is filled up. We're gonna turn on our engine, and that'll get our water pump going and circulating the water into the engine. And so we could put in a little bit more water here, whatever might be necessary. So let's go turn it on. So pretty simply, we're gonna turn on our engine. So now we can let our vehicle run, and we're gonna be checking our temperature to make sure it doesn't get too high or spike or whatever it might be. And with the vehicle on, we're going to let it get up to operating temperature. Doing that will get the thermostat to open and allow the engine to fully circulate. After letting the engine run, let's top off our engine, let's fill our reservoir, and that's it. And that is how you change a water pump in your vehicle. A lot of times it's going to be a lot simpler than this, but that's how you do it.